My sister raised her glass and laughed just loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear. Declan built a startup, she said, smiling as if she were sharing something funny instead of cruel. But honestly, it's embarrassing. The words landed right in the middle of Sunday lunch, between the roast chicken and the bowl of buttered potatoes, and for a second even the clinking forks seemed to pause. My name is Declan Hawthorne, and I still remember the heat rising into my face as every pair of eyes turned toward me. Olivia leaned back in her chair with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted her place in the world. She worked at a respected consulting firm, wore polished clothes even to family lunches, and always spoke as if the room belonged to her. "You should see his office," she went on. "One tiny desk, one old laptop, and pages of scribbles everywhere. He calls that a company." A few people laughed politely. Not because they meant to be cruel, I think, but because Olivia had a way of making everyone follow her lead. I kept my eyes on my plate and cut another piece of chicken, even though I had lost my appetite. I had spent the last 2 years building my startup out of a cramped apartment, one long night at a time. I had skipped weekends, skipped rest, and sometimes skipped meals just to keep it alive. Most people in my family thought it was a phase, some hobby I would grow out of when reality finally caught up with me. Olivia had never bothered to hide that she was one of them. My cousin Aaron cleared his throat and asked, almost kindly, "So what does your startup actually do, Declan?" I looked up, ready to answer for myself, but Olivia jumped in before I could say a word. "Nothing important," she said with a light wave of her hand. "It's just another tech fantasy. He's been hiding in that apartment for 2 years pretending he's building something big." This time the laughter was sharper, and I felt my father shift in his seat as if he wanted to say something but chose not to. I should have defended myself. I should have told them about the calls, the demos, the emails I had been getting for weeks. I should have told them that 3 companies had already tested my software and that one of them had asked questions no casual browser would ever think to ask. But nothing was certain yet, and I had learned the hard way that talking too early only made failure louder. So I stayed calm, lifted my glass, and acted as if none of it had touched me. Then my phone buzzed against the table. At first, I ignored it. I thought it might be another unknown number, another inquiry that would end with polite interest and nothing more. But the buzzing came again, stronger this time, and when I glanced down, something inside me went still. It was a number I didn't recognize, but underneath it was the name of a company I had only seen in industry articles and business reports. I stared at the screen for one breath too long, and Olivia noticed. "Well," she said with a grin, "is that your big break calling?" I picked up the phone, and for the first time all afternoon, my hand was not steady. 2 years earlier, my life looked nothing like the one Olivia liked to mock. I lived in a tiny apartment above a grocery store on Willow Street, the kind of place people rented when they were either just starting out or trying very hard not to fall behind. The floors creaked whenever I crossed the room, the pipes knocked in the walls at night, and the front window rattled whenever delivery trucks rolled past before sunrise. It wasn't the sort of place anyone would imagine a company being born in. Still, every morning when I sat at the little wooden desk near the window, that was exactly what I believed I was building. At the time, the software didn't even have a proper company around it. I had given it a working name, Clear Ledger, and that was enough for me. The idea came from watching small shop owners struggle with tools that were far too complex for what they actually needed. They didn't want 10 dashboards and 50 reports. They wanted to know what they had earned, what they had spent, what bills were coming, and whether they could breathe next month. I wanted to build something simple enough for them to use without fear and smart enough to actually help. The kind of tool that removed confusion instead of adding to it. The problem was that belief and rent do not move together. During the day, I took freelance tech support jobs and helped local businesses fix slow computers, broken printers, and half-working networks. At night I came home, made cheap coffee, and wrote code until my eyes burned. There were weeks when I slept in pieces and measured time by software versions instead of days. My friends stopped inviting me out. My landlord started giving me that careful look people give when they think a tenant may be in trouble. Even my mother, who loved me deeply, had once said, "Maybe there's no shame in finding a stable job for a while, Declan." She meant well. That somehow made it hurt more. Still, there were moments that kept me going. The first time the budgeting screen loaded correctly after crashing for 3 straight nights, I laughed out loud in an empty room. The first time a bakery owner used an early version and said, "This actually makes sense," I nearly walked home floating. Tiny moments, tiny wins, but enough to keep me moving. I didn't need the world to believe in it yet. I just needed proof that the thing in my head could become something real. Most people never saw that part. They saw the small apartment, the old laptop, the unpaid hours, and the uncertainty. They saw a man in his early 30s living like a student and called it a mistake. Olivia was especially good at reducing sacrifice into failure. In her version of my life, I wasn't building patiently. I was hiding from adulthood. She had the polished office, the clean salary, the neat answer when people asked what she did. I had late nights, faded notebooks, and a startup that still looked invisible from the outside. But every once in a while, life gave me a strange little sign that I wasn't completely alone in seeing what Clear Ledger could become. The first of those signs arrived one cold morning on the corner near my building, in the shape of an old man selling tea from a metal cart. His name was Elias. I met Elias during a week when I had almost given up. One part of the software kept breaking every time I fixed another, my savings were dropping faster than I wanted to admit, and I had started calculating how many more months I could stay in that apartment if nothing changed. On the fourth morning of that week, after a night with almost no sleep, I stepped outside to clear my head before I threw my laptop through the window. The air was cold, the street was still wet from early rain, and near the corner I noticed a ribbon of steam curling up into the gray morning. That was the first time I saw the tea cart. It was simple, almost old-fashioned, with a polished kettle, stacked paper cups, and handwritten labels tied to glass jars of ginger, mint, and loose black tea. Behind it stood a thin older man with silver hair, steady hands, and eyes that seemed to notice far more than he let on. I had never seen him before, though I had passed that corner 100 times. Before I could even ask for anything, he poured tea into a small cup and held it toward me. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired," I answered, taking the cup. He nodded as if I had confirmed something obvious. "What keeps you awake?" I should have given him a simple answer. Most people did not really want the truth when they asked casual questions. But there was something about the way he said it that made me speak honestly. "I'm building something," I told him. "What kind of something?" "A company." He smiled then, and what struck me most was that it was not a smile of amusement. There was no polite doubt in it, no hidden pity, no look that said, "Poor man, he's trying." It was the kind of smile you give when someone says something difficult but possible. "What does your company do?" he asked. "It's software for small businesses," I said. "A tool to help them track money without getting buried in complicated systems." He gave a thoughtful nod, as if weighing the idea properly. "That sounds useful." I actually laughed. "You're the first person who said that." "Then the people around you are not paying attention," he said, handing me the tea. "Big ideas often look small in the beginning." I carried that sentence with me the whole day. I heard it later that night while I worked, and again the next morning when I returned to his cart. After that, stopping by became part of my routine. I would buy tea, and Elias would ask, "How is the company growing?" Not "How is the project going," not "Are you still trying," but "How is the company growing," as if its existence had already been settled. That quiet confidence did something to me. It steadied me. Over the next few months, I learned almost nothing about him and yet came to rely on him more than I expected. He never talked much about himself. He never offered long speeches. But now and then, he would say something so perfectly timed that it felt less like advice and more like a small rescue. On mornings when I looked defeated, he would simply say, "Keep building." On mornings when I looked restless, he would ask, "Are you listening to what the work is telling you?" Strange words from a man selling tea on a corner. Stranger still was the fact that they always helped. That was the beginning of it. Not the acquisition, not the call during Sunday lunch, not the silence that would later fall across my family's table. The beginning was a rattling apartment, a half-finished piece of software, and an old man with a tea cart who believed in my company before anyone else did. Over the next few months, stopping at Elias's tea cart became part of my daily rhythm. I would step outside before the city fully woke up, buy a cup of ginger tea, and stand beside the cart while the morning light crept between the buildings. Most days our conversations were short, but somehow they always landed exactly where I needed them. Elias had a quiet way of listening that made even simple words feel important. When I talked about bugs in my code or customers who didn't understand what I was trying to build, he never brushed it aside. Instead, he asked questions that made me think deeper. One morning I told him about a bakery owner who had tested my software and said it helped her finally understand her expenses. It was only one person, but it had meant a lot to me. Elias nodded slowly as if the story confirmed something he already suspected. "One good solution," he said, "can change the future for many people." I remember smiling at that. It sounded like something a mentor might say, not a man selling tea on a sidewalk corner. Still, life outside that little conversation circle remained difficult. My savings were shrinking, and the pressure from family was growing louder. Olivia called me one evening and asked if I had considered applying for a real job. She said it in the same tone she used when explaining something obvious to a child. I thanked her for the suggestion and changed the subject, but the words followed me long after the call ended. That night I worked later than usual. The small apartment filled with the glow of my screen and the steady tapping of keys as I rewrote parts of the reporting system. Around midnight I leaned back in my chair and realized that despite everything, despite the doubts and the jokes, I still believed the software mattered. Somewhere out there were thousands of business owners like the bakery woman who needed something simple and honest. The next morning when I stopped at the tea cart, Elias looked at me carefully before speaking. "You worked late?" he said. I nodded. And yet you came back again. Yes. He smiled gently and poured another cup of tea. Then the company is still alive. Not long after that, Olivia decided to visit my apartment. She said she was in the area, which usually meant she wanted to check how badly my life was going. When I opened the door and saw her standing in the hallway with a perfectly pressed coat and a look of polite curiosity, I knew the visit would not be pleasant. She stepped inside slowly, glancing around the room as if she were inspecting a hotel she might review online. My apartment was clean but small. The desk by the window held my laptop, a stack of notebooks, and a whiteboard leaning against the wall covered with diagrams and calculations. To me, it looked like progress. To Olivia, it looked like failure. "So this is headquarters," she said lightly, touching the edge of the desk. "For now," I replied. She walked across the room and peered at the whiteboard. "You've been doing this for 2 years, Declan," she said after a moment. "Don't you think it's time to face reality?" I didn't answer right away. I had heard that sentence in different forms many times before. Sometimes from relatives, sometimes from friends who meant well. They all believed they were helping me wake up from a dream. Olivia simply said it more directly than most. "I am facing reality," I told her quietly. "Building something just takes time." She sighed as if patience were a childish excuse. "You're talented," she said. "You could work at a real company and make good money. Instead you're hiding in this apartment pretending to be a founder." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. But arguing with Olivia rarely changed anything, so I let the silence stretch between us. After a while she shook her head and picked up her coat. "I just don't want to see you embarrass yourself," she said. When she left, the apartment felt very quiet. I went back to my desk and opened the software again. The following weeks brought small changes I didn't fully understand at first. A few local businesses began sending questions about ClearLedger through the contact form on my website. One cafe owner wanted to know if the system could track daily ingredient costs. A repair shop asked if it could organize invoices automatically. None of these requests were huge breakthroughs, but they felt like proof that the idea was slowly reaching people. Every morning I told Elias about the new messages while sipping tea beside his cart. He listened with that same calm attention he always showed, as if each small step mattered more than I realized. One day after hearing about another inquiry, he looked down the quiet street and said something unusual. "You help people because you believe they deserve clarity," he said. "That kind of work attracts attention." I laughed softly. "If it attracts attention, it's taking its time." "Not everything moves quickly," he replied. "Sometimes the right eyes are watching long before you know it." At the time I assumed he meant customers who might eventually discover the software. I had no reason to think his words carried any deeper meaning. Still, the sentence stayed with me throughout the day. I returned to my apartment, worked on improving the dashboard design, and answered emails until evening. A few days later something else happened. I received a message from a company I had never heard of before. The sender asked several detailed questions about the architecture of my software and whether I planned to expand it for larger organizations. The questions were far more technical than anything I had received from small businesses. I stared at the email for a long moment before replying carefully. After sending the message, I leaned back in my chair and wondered how they had even found me. The next morning I walked to the corner to ask Elias if he had ever heard of the company. But when I reached the tea cart, the space was empty. For the first time since I had started stopping there, the corner felt strangely quiet. The small metal cart was gone, the kettle that usually hissed with steam was nowhere in sight, and the familiar scent of ginger tea had disappeared into the cool morning air. I stood there longer than necessary, looking up and down the sidewalk as if Elias might appear from one of the nearby streets pushing the cart back into place. But the corner remained empty. A flower vendor across the road noticed me lingering and asked if I was looking for the tea seller. I nodded and asked if she knew where he had gone. She shook her head slowly and said he had packed up early the day before without saying much to anyone. "Old man like that probably just moved on," she said, arranging flowers in a bucket. "People come and go in this city." Her answer left me with an odd feeling I couldn't explain. Elias had never mentioned leaving. He had never talked about family or travel plans or anything that suggested his routine might change. He had simply been there every morning, steady as the sunrise. Now the corner looked like any other ordinary street intersection, and somehow that ordinary view felt wrong. I walked back toward my apartment still thinking about it. On the way upstairs I checked my phone and noticed something new in my inbox. The company that had written to me earlier had replied again. This time the message was shorter but more serious. They thanked me for my explanation and asked if I would be open to demonstrating the software in a live call sometime that week. I sat down at my desk and read the email twice. The name of the company still meant nothing to me, but the questions they asked suggested they understood my work far better than a casual visitor would. Later that afternoon I prepared carefully for the demonstration. My apartment didn't exactly look like a professional office, but I cleared the desk, cleaned the whiteboard, and positioned my laptop where the camera would show the room in the best possible light. When the meeting began, 3 people appeared on the screen. They introduced themselves politely and asked if I could walk them through the software step by step. At first I assumed they were just exploring options, the way curious companies sometimes did when searching for new tools. But as the conversation continued, their questions became deeper and more specific. They asked about the algorithms behind the financial summaries, about the way the software predicted future expenses, and about how the system might scale if thousands of users joined at once. Their interest surprised me. Most people who saw the software only focused on the surface features. These 3 seemed interested in the structure underneath, the parts one had built quietly during long nights of trial and error. When the call ended nearly an hour later, they thanked me and said they might contact me again soon. I closed the laptop slowly, still trying to process what had just happened. For 2 years I had struggled to convince anyone that ClearLedger was worth serious attention. Now strangers I had never met were studying it as if it mattered. That evening another message arrived. This time it was from a different company. They also wanted a demonstration. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen, wondering how my little project had suddenly appeared on so many radars at once. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered Elias saying, "Sometimes the right eyes are watching long before you know it." Over the next 2 weeks my schedule changed in ways I hadn't expected. Instead of working alone through endless nights of quiet coding, I found myself preparing for more demonstrations. Small teams from different companies asked to see the software and learn how it worked. Some conversations lasted only 15 minutes, while others stretched longer as the callers explored details I had once assumed no one would care about. Despite the growing attention, I kept most of this news to myself. Experience had taught me that excitement could vanish quickly if things did not work out. Until something real happened, I preferred to move quietly and keep building. Still, the sudden interest made me curious about one thing: how all these companies had discovered ClearLedger in the first place. My website had never been heavily promoted, and my marketing efforts were almost non-existent. Yet the emails kept arriving, each from a different organization, each asking similar questions. One evening I noticed something unusual while reading through one of the messages. Near the bottom of the email, after the technical questions, there was a short line that caught my attention. "Your work was recommended to us by someone we trust." I read the sentence again, hoping the name of that person would appear somewhere in the message. But no name followed the statement. Whoever had recommended my software had chosen to remain invisible. For a moment I wondered if Elias might somehow be connected. The thought seemed unlikely. After all, he was a quiet tea vendor who spent his mornings serving drinks on a street corner. But his sudden disappearance and those strange words he had spoken weeks earlier now returned to my mind with new weight. Before I could think about it further, another notification appeared on my phone. This time the email carried a subject line that made my chest tighten. The message was from a corporate acquisitions team, and they wanted to talk about buying my company. For several minutes I simply stared at the email on my screen, reading the subject line again and again as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more ordinary. An acquisition discussion was not something small startups like mine usually received, especially when they were still operating out of a cramped apartment above a grocery store. Yet the message looked legitimate. The sender's address matched the company's domain, and the language inside was polite, direct, and carefully professional. They explained that their team had reviewed ClearLedger's structure and believed it had strong potential for wider use. Because of that, they wanted to schedule a private conversation about the possibility of acquiring the technology and integrating it into their own systems. At the end of the email they added one more sentence that stood out to me. "Your work was brought to our attention by a trusted advisor." Again there was no name. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet apartment settle around me while my mind tried to catch up with what I had just read. 2 years earlier I had started writing the first lines of code for ClearLedger without any expectation that anyone outside my tiny circle would ever notice it. Now companies I had never contacted were reaching out, asking thoughtful questions and even discussing acquisition. Part of me felt excited. Another part felt cautious. Nothing was certain yet, and I knew better than to celebrate too early. Still, I replied to the email, thanking them for their interest and agreeing to schedule a call later that week. When I sent the message, I noticed the late afternoon sun shining through my apartment window. The room looked the same as it always had, same desk, same whiteboard, same tired laptop, but somehow the air inside felt different. Something had begun to move. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. I reviewed every part of the software, checked the numbers behind the financial projections, and rewrote sections of my presentation to make sure the system's strengths were clear. Even though the conversation might turn out to be only exploratory, I wanted to approach it seriously. Opportunities like this rarely appeared twice. During that time my family knew nothing about what was happening. Olivia continued to speak about my startup as if it were a harmless joke she enjoyed repeating. At another family gathering she told a cousin that I was still hiding in that little apartment playing entrepreneur. I smiled politely and said nothing. The truth was beginning to unfold quietly on its own, and I didn't feel the need to rush it. The call with the acquisitions team happened on a Thursday afternoon. This time there were more people on the screen, including 2 executives who listened carefully while I explained how Clearledger worked and why small businesses found it useful. Their questions were thoughtful and surprisingly respectful. Instead of dismissing the software as a simple tool, they asked about its future, its adaptability, and its potential if given proper resources. Near the end of the meeting, one of them said something that made me pause. "We understand you built this entirely on your own," she said. "Yes," I replied. "That level of discipline is rare," she said. "It tells us a lot about the person behind the product." When the call ended, they promised to stay in contact. For the first time since building Clearledger, I allowed myself to imagine a future where the software might reach far beyond my little apartment. That weekend arrived quietly, the way ordinary weekends usually do. Saturday morning passed with a few emails and some minor updates to the software. By Sunday, the sky was clear and bright, and my mother had invited everyone over for lunch as she often did. Family gatherings were never my favorite events, but I went anyway. Despite Olivia's teasing, they were still my family. The dining room smelled wonderful when I arrived. My mother had cooked roast chicken, vegetables, and fresh bread, and the table was already full of conversation by the time I sat down. For a while the afternoon unfolded peacefully. My father talked about a neighbor who had just retired, my aunt described a small garden she had started, and my cousin joked about traffic in the city. Then, as it often did, the conversation turned toward careers. Olivia had just finished telling a story about a project at her consulting firm when someone asked what I had been working on lately. Before I could answer, she leaned forward with the same confident smile she had worn many times before. "Declan's been busy with his startup again," she said. The tone of her voice made the sentence sound like a punchline rather than a fact. Several people looked at me curiously, waiting for an explanation. Olivia, however, didn't give me the chance. She raised her glass slightly and laughed. "Honestly," she said, "it's embarrassing." A few people chuckled. I kept my expression calm and focused on the plate in front of me. At that exact moment, my phone buzzed against the table. The screen lit up with a number I didn't recognize. And underneath it was the name of the acquisitions company. The phone continued vibrating softly against the table while everyone waited for my reaction. Olivia noticed the screen light up and gave me a playful look, as if she expected the call to confirm whatever joke she had just made. "Well," she said, "is that another investor begging to fund your empire?" The room filled with light laughter again. I picked up the phone calmly, stood from the table and said, "Excuse me for a moment." My voice sounded steadier than I felt as I walked toward the back door that led into the quiet garden behind my parents' house. The afternoon sun was warm outside, and the sound of distant traffic hummed softly beyond the fence. For a second I just stared at the phone, letting it ring once more before answering. When I finally pressed the green button, a clear professional voice greeted me. "Good afternoon, is this Declan Hawthorne?" "Yes, this is Declan. This is Adrian Cole calling from the acquisitions department at Northbridge Systems. We spoke earlier this week." My heart beat faster, but I kept my tone calm. "Yes, I remember. We've completed our initial review of your software," he continued, "and we would like to move forward with a formal acquisition discussion." For a moment I didn't speak. The words felt unreal hanging in the air between us. He continued gently, "Our team believes Clearledger has significant potential. We'd like to present you with an offer." I slowly exhaled, trying to keep my thoughts organized. "An offer?" I repeated. "Yes," he said. "If you have a few minutes, I can share the details now." I looked back toward the house where my family was still eating lunch. Inside that room, they thought my startup was a joke. Outside, my life had just begun to change. I stepped farther into the garden to hear clearly. The trees cast soft shadows across the grass while Adrian explained the proposal. Northbridge Systems, he said, had been studying financial software tools for small businesses. When Clearledger appeared on their radar, the team had quietly reviewed its structure, tested its predictive tools, and compared it with several existing platforms. Their conclusion had surprised them. Clearledger wasn't just a simple budgeting tool. The predictive engine I had built, the part that estimated future expenses based on past spending patterns, was more advanced than most small business platforms offered. Adrian explained that integrating that technology into their larger ecosystem could help thousands of businesses manage cash flow more clearly. Then he told me the number. For a second the garden felt very still. The offer was far larger than anything I had imagined. It wasn't the kind of amount that turned someone into a billionaire overnight, but it was life-changing money for someone who had spent 2 years worrying about rent. Adrian spoke carefully while I absorbed the information. "Of course," he added, "this is only our opening proposal. We would also like you to remain involved in the product after acquisition." I nodded slowly, even though he couldn't see me. "That sounds serious," I said. "It is serious," he replied. "Your work impressed our advisory team." That phrase caught my attention again. "Your advisory team?" I asked. Yes, he said. One of our senior advisors recommended we take a closer look at your software months ago. My curiosity sharpened. May I ask who that advisor is? Adrian paused for a moment. That's something you may find out soon enough, he said with a small laugh. When the call ended, I stayed in the garden for a few minutes, letting the quiet settle around me. My hands were still slightly shaky, and the weight of what had just happened felt almost unreal. 2 years earlier I had started writing code alone in a small apartment. Now a large company wanted to buy the software I had built with nothing but patience and stubborn belief. Eventually I walked back toward the house. The dining room was still full of conversation when I stepped inside. My mother was pouring more tea while Olivia leaned back in her chair telling another story about work. As soon as she saw me return, she smiled with playful curiosity. Well, she asked. Was that your big investor? Everyone turned to look at me again. For a moment I considered staying quiet and letting the conversation drift somewhere else. But something about the afternoon, the months of doubt, the laughter at the table, the call I had just received, made me decide differently. It was a company, I said calmly. Olivia raised an eyebrow. Oh, they're interested in acquiring my software. The words landed softly in the room, but the reaction was immediate. The laughter faded and several people looked at me with surprise. Olivia blinked once, clearly unsure whether I was joking. Acquiring, she repeated. Yes. And how much do they want to pay for it? She asked with a half smile. I hesitated for a second, then told them the number Adrian had mentioned. The silence that followed felt heavier than any laughter had. Olivia's smile slowly disappeared. For the first time that afternoon, no one at the table seemed to know what to say. For several seconds the room stayed completely quiet. My mother's teapot hovered above a cup, forgotten halfway through pouring. My father leaned back slightly in his chair, studying my face as if he were trying to decide whether I was serious. Even my cousin, who usually had a joke ready for any situation, simply stared. Olivia was the first to speak again. You're joking, she said, though her voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. I shook my head. No, she crossed her arms slowly. Companies don't just buy random software projects. It's not random, I replied calmly. She looked around the table as if hoping someone else would confirm her disbelief. Declan, be honest. Are they actually offering money, or are they just interested? They made an offer, I said. How much? I had already told them once, but I repeated the number quietly. This time the silence lasted longer. My father cleared his throat first. That's quite an offer. My aunt blinked twice and whispered, for a program you built yourself? Yes. Olivia leaned forward again, her eyes narrowing slightly. Companies don't spend that kind of money unless they see something valuable, she said slowly. So what exactly did you build? The question carried a different tone now. It wasn't teasing anymore. It was cautious. I explained briefly how ClearLedger worked, how it helped small businesses track their finances clearly and predict future expenses. I kept the explanation simple, but I could see the shift happening around the table. The thing Olivia had called embarrassing no longer sounded so small. Lunch continued, but the mood had changed completely. Earlier the room had been full of light teasing and casual conversation. Now every word seemed more careful. My cousin asked questions about how the software worked, while my father wanted to know how long the company had been studying it. Even my aunt seemed curious about how a program written in a small apartment could attract such attention. Olivia, however, had grown quiet. She watched me closely while I answered everyone's questions, her expression thoughtful instead of amused. I had known my sister long enough to recognize that look. It meant she was reconsidering something she had already decided about me. Eventually she leaned forward again. So when do you hear back from them? She asked. They said they would send the official proposal tomorrow, I replied. And you're actually thinking about selling? I'm thinking about it, I said. Selling the software meant it could reach thousands of businesses instead of a handful of early users. But it also meant letting go of something I had built piece by piece with my own hands. The decision wasn't simple. Olivia nodded slowly. Well, congratulations, she said. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from her. For years she had been certain my startup would fail. Now that belief was clearly shaking. While everyone else resumed their conversation, I noticed something else. My phone vibrated again. Another message had arrived from Northbridge Systems. I opened it quietly beneath the table. The message was short. Our advisory team would like to meet you in person this week. And suddenly the story was becoming bigger than I had expected. Later that evening I returned to my apartment and read the message several times. Northbridge wanted me to visit their headquarters on Wednesday morning. They explained that the acquisition team would present the full proposal, discuss future plans for ClearLedger, and answer any questions I might have about the process. The idea of walking into a large corporate office still felt strange. For 2 years my entire company had lived inside a small room above a grocery store. My whiteboard held every major decision I had made, and my laptop contained every line of code. Now executives in glass offices wanted to talk about integrating that work into a global system. Part of me felt proud. Another part felt curious about something else. The advisor who had recommended my software. The mystery had been mentioned several times now, but no one had revealed the person's identity. Whoever they were, they had discovered ClearLedger long before the acquisition team had contacted me. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. My thoughts drifted to the empty street corner where Elias used to sell tea. The memory felt oddly connected to everything that had happened since his disappearance. I remembered his calm voice asking how the company was growing, the way he spoke about the future as if he could already see it. It was probably coincidence. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the situation didn't fully add up. On Wednesday morning, I would finally meet the people behind the offer. And perhaps learn who had been watching my work all along. Wednesday morning arrived sooner than I expected. I woke before my alarm, the same way I used to wake during the long nights when ClearLedger was nothing more than lines of code and quiet hope. The small apartment looked exactly as it always had, sunlight touching the window, the whiteboard leaning against the wall, the laptop resting on the desk. Yet the room felt different now. It felt like the place where something important had begun. I dressed simply and left early, taking the train toward the financial district where Northbridge Systems had its headquarters. As the buildings grew taller outside the window, I thought about the strange path that had brought me here. 2 years earlier I had been writing software alone at that desk. Now I was on my way to meet executives who wanted to buy it. Northbridge's building stood several stories high with wide glass windows that reflected the morning sky. Inside, the lobby was bright and quiet, filled with the soft sound of footsteps and low conversations. A receptionist greeted me politely and asked me to wait while she notified the acquisitions team. A few minutes later, a tall woman in a dark jacket approached and introduced herself as Natalie Ward, the director overseeing the deal. She shook my hand warmly and guided me through a hallway lined with conference rooms. "We're glad you could come, Declan," she said. "I'm glad to be here," I replied. When we reached the main meeting room, several people were already seated around a large table. Screens on the wall displayed charts and diagrams that looked strangely familiar. They were diagrams of ClearLedger. And that's when I realized this company had studied my work very carefully. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. Natalie and her team walked me through their evaluation of ClearLedger step by step. They explained how the software's prediction engine could help businesses plan future expenses and avoid sudden financial problems. They showed graphs estimating how many small companies might benefit if the system were expanded across Northbridge's existing network. Listening to them talk about my software felt surreal. They spoke about it as if it were already part of something larger, something with reach and influence far beyond my little apartment. When the presentation ended, Natalie folded her hands on the table. "We believe your work fills a gap that many businesses struggle with," she said. "That's why we're offering to acquire ClearLedger and bring you on as a lead developer for the project." She slid a document across the table toward me. The numbers were the same ones Adrian had mentioned during the phone call, but now they looked even more real, written on official papers. I took a slow breath and asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the first email arrived. "There's one thing I'm curious about," I said. "You mentioned an advisor who recommended my work." Natalie nodded. "Yes. Who is that?" She exchanged a quick glance with one of the executives beside her before answering. "He prefers not to take public credit," she said carefully. "But I believe he plans to meet you today." My curiosity sharpened. "Today?" I asked. She smiled slightly. "Yes. He asked specifically to speak with you after the meeting." After the meeting ended, Natalie guided me toward a smaller office down the hallway. The building was quiet at that hour, with only the faint sound of keyboards and distant conversations drifting through the corridor. My mind raced with possibilities about the mysterious advisor. Perhaps it was an investor, or a professor who had come across my work online.